I really think that Mike used cult tactics. I think he is a cult leader. I'm not ready to understand the whole big dynamic of IHOP in general. Like, give me some years. I don't even know how to parse it all. But I will say that with his victims, he was just a cult leader with these women. I mean, the way that he used prophetic words to lock them in, the way he, you know, won their whole family systems. But the spiritual part, I don't think people have understood how deep that is.
Well, joining me today is someone who knew Mike Bickle at the very beginning of the International House of Prayer in Kansas City. And she actually roomed with one of his victims, Deborah Perkins, and also Misty Edwards, who's a very well-known worship leader at the International House of Prayer. For most of the time that my guest was at IHOPKC, as it's often referred to, she believed that Mike Bickle was healing her from the sexual abuse that she had received as a child from her own father. But today she believes that Mike Bickle was actually grooming her so that he could sexually abuse her friends. My guest today is Shelley Hundley, and she joins me now from another state. I won't say which one, but it is so great to be with you, Shelley, and thanks so much for taking the time.
Glad to be here, Julie.
And for a lot of folks, this idea that that Mike Bickle would groom someone to sexually abuse their friends, and I know we're going to walk that out and exactly what that looked like, but just kind of in a nutshell, what do you mean by that? That he groomed you so that he could sexually abuse your friends?
I think for me, what I mean by that is that when I look back, I see, as you mentioned, I came from a sexual abuse background. And interestingly, with Mike, he didn't, as far as the survivors that I've known of and have talked to and different things, it seems like he selected the girls who came from these intact families and then kind of prepped their whole family. He prepped the father to, in the case of Tammy Woods, and as well as Deborah Perkins, he had these strong relationships with them. And then everybody around his victims worshiped him and just had this deep connection with him. And so as I was putting pieces back in my own story, that is really what I believe has happened in my own life, is that he became this super father to me as I came in, as this young little 20-year-old-ish, around that age, being around him. This father that took up so much space that it normalized things like him coming in and out of the house of us girls that lived together, or the many, many, many times that he was in a back room in a closed door with one of these girls that you've mentioned, just so I look back at it now and I go, I was so tightly connected to him so that I would not notice all that was going on around. So that's kind of what I mean by that.
And you're not alone in saying things like that. So many people say now in retrospect, the things that they saw Mike do, they're like, duh, like what was I thinking? But because of the culture he created, because of the way that people were groomed to just think that he was the most pure thing that's, ever walked the earth, they didn't see these things as red flags that they should have. And that's a very, very unfortunately common phenomenon with these kind of abusive and predatory leaders. So I think you're going to shed a lot of light on that as we walk out your story, but do really appreciate you being willing to talk about this. And I know part of your motivation, and not just to talk about these kind of characteristics and grooming behaviors, but also in hopes that some of those who maybe doubted any of the abuse victims, that you could corroborate their stories, but also for those who are still blinded themselves. And unfortunately, that seems to be the case, that he still has people in his grip, that they might, have an epiphany and be able to walk out of really a grip of darkness that's on them right now. Let's start with your background. I made reference to it already, but your parents were missionaries in Colombia. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that someone who would go as a missionary to another country is actually a sexual abuser, but that's who your father was. Tell me a bit about that background growing up and kind of how that predisposed you as a young adult?
Yeah, my parents were missionaries in Colombia, and that was a beautiful place for me. Growing up, it was a little wild. It was the Pablo Escobar years. I was born in Medellin, and it was a high risk place to be a missionary. And I don't have all the answers of what went on with my dad. He's passed away now, and I have told my story many times and even written a book. And at that time, didn't name that it was my dad that was the abuser in my life, but everyone that knows me knows that, and I'm comfortable saying that now at this point. But whatever was going on in his own heart, he ended up sexually abusing a large number of children, boys and girls. It was kind of anyone who was around my age group who he had access to in our home was sexually abused by him. And then within our family system, it was physical abuse. I was sexually abused horribly. Different ones of us had different experiences amongst the siblings, but it was a absolute, Jekyll and Hyde type of situations of what was going on behind the scenes and what he was doing. And he was a very influential Methodist preacher. His teaching was it was good. He's connected to Asbury College and Asbury Seminary, a solid, place, a solid background. And that secret held all the way through my life. I never knew other children were being victimized until right before I went to college. Some things had broken out before then, but I wasn't aware yet that they had. He was going to be promoted to president of a large mission organization, and that's when his victims, who are now adults, began to come forward really courageously. And it took a long time for all of that truth to trickle to me and my siblings. But then in the end, when we did find out about it, there was a huge crisis of faith for all of us within our family system. I know for me, I went into depression and suicidal struggles through my college years. And so that was kind of the background for me. The person I would have mistrusted the most in the whole world would have been a pastor because of that dynamic with my dad, where he was such a gifted preacher, and then the sexual abuse was going on behind the scenes and physical abuse that was just so bad. And I began my counseling process at that time, and there was a part of me that wanted to be able to work through it, but it was a crisis time for me during my college years, dealing with all of that.
And what you said is what I've experienced in my reporting, that these men who sometimes are very gifted preachers are maybe not sexual abusers themselves. Sometimes they are, but they are ones that cover for other sexual abusers. They can be incredibly cruel, like this complete Jekyll and Hyde. And the public has such a tough time coming to grips with it because they're good preachers. And we always thought, I know I grew up in a totally different situation in a really godly home with godly parents who lived and walked what they taught. I was very blessed that way. And so I just always assumed that the bad guys, that would do something like this were outside of our tribe. Like they were, people that needed to be saved, not the ones, and maybe we don't know that these men that live these double lives don't need to be saved. In fact, I would guess that they do, because you know a tree by its fruit. But how people can live that compartmentalized of a life. And again, we're going to be talking about Mike Bickle. So, speaking of which, but it is just absolutely mind-numbing to see these things happening. And as you said, you went through a crisis of faith. You ended up going to Asbury, which sounds like that was your denominational school where probably people expected you to go. Yet when you're there, you're not pursuing God at all at this point. In fact, that lasted for a couple of years till you really encountered God. Tell me a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, so I went there because in our family, you could go to any college you wanted, but that was the one that my parents would pay for. So that was,
That kind of narrows it down.
Yeah. So, but going there was it was intense because a lot of people that my dad had victimized were connected to the institution or, even in the area. And it was crazy to be in that environment. It was really difficult, made things harder. But yeah, I never got into drugs and alcohol. I tried a few times and I'd always get caught at the last second before I quit. I think there was a safety net for me, but I was the most vocal anti-Jesus person around. I refused to go to chapel. which is required for Asbury. I got called into the dean's office for that. And I just remember he asked me to sit down, and I said no. I didn't even want to. No, let him down. And
I like your spunk, though.
I have a lot of spunk, and I said, no, I'm not sitting down. And he said, you haven't attended chapel, and, that's a core part of our coursework here, et cetera. You have to do it. And I just, since I was standing in my active position, I said, I am, and I said my dad's name, daughter. Do you have any effing question why I would not go to chapel? I mean, I'm sorry, but that was my favorite word. I said,
Wow.
do you have a question about why I would not? Because everyone knew. Everyone knew about my dad. And he just looked up at me and said, no, I don't. And he just signed a piece of paper and handed it to me. And that was that. I was fierce against people who wanted to talk to me about Jesus. I think, and it kind of speaks to the Mike Bickle story as well, because in my own story, that's what happens when a member of clergy, a trusted pastor, abuses. They mingle all this spirituality, and the whole thing gets flushed through that. I mean, often, not always, but the ability to rescue some image of God was impossible for me at that time of my life. And I didn't want to hear anything. And I knew all the Bible verses. I'd grown up with all of the things. And so I frequently cussed people out on my dorm hall that would try to talk to me about Jesus. And people knew I was troubled and depressed and didn't, show up to things I was supposed to show up to. So I had quite a few people trying to talk to me about Jesus. And I would leave them in tears. Not because I was an atheist, but I was not like some really intellectual, smart, putting thoughts together. I was very emotional about it. I basically felt like if you hadn't experienced the violation and all of the horrible things, and I would just put it in the, most crass terms to them and say, have you experienced this? Has this happened to you by a pastor? Has a pastor done this? Has a preacher done this to you? Then shut the bleep up. And I would leave people crying and backing away. And, to make it short, a group of students on my campus were really praying for revival. And they had a kind of a ringleader that ended up being a professor I got for history, Dr. Robert Neff. And they met at his house for Bible studies. And they were reading through William Booth from the Salvation Army, his journals. And he talked about finding the hardest heart that would never turn to God, and zeroing in on that person and seeing the ripple effect of what God would do if you got the one that people couldn't believe you'd get. And it's just beautiful. They picked me, and they just started praying and pursuing me. And I didn't know that, of course, that had happened. I was on my own journey, hospitalized for depression and being interrupted in the middle of a suicide attempt. And I had cried out to God in a certain kind of a way, pretty weak way, really. But I had basically done one of those, if you're real, show yourself to me. And the phrase that I said when I was in the hospital at that time was, you have to show me between just you and me that you're real, not through somebody that I have to believe. And you have to show me that you can do something about this pain. That was the thing I said. They asked if they could pray for me, and I said yes, because I thought it meant bye. And they put a chair in the room and began to pray over me, just gathered around me and put their hands on me and prayed for me. And it would take too long to explain all of it, but I experienced the Lord. Like pretty much for the first moment, I experienced the first answer to my prayer, that God showed me he was really real, just between me and him. It wasn't like a vision or something like that, but it was this very tangible presence of God. And then the second part was this girl who named Molly, who was praying right near my feet, just right on the floor in front of me. And she was just sobbing and sobbing and sobbing the whole prayer time. I was actually thinking, I think she needs help. Like I was kind of thinking, there's something going on with this girl. And but what was happening was she was feeling God's love for me. And at a certain point, she was able to kind of climb up and get close to my ear. And she said, it's just that he loves you so much. And when she said that, it dawned on me, because I had yelled at her, cussed at her, mistreated her. She was on my hall. I thought, that's not human. Like, there's no way that a person could feel that without coming in contact with a real God that feels it. And I felt like if a person can feel that, if God loves me, that's neat. But like, if a person can feel that love, then that means I could feel it. And if I could feel it, then that's the answer to my question. That would be enough to deal with this pain. And honestly, that's really kind of the segue that sent me into why I went to IHOP soon after, which wasn't IHOP yet, but why I was drawn to Mike Bickle was the message of the love of God was my focus from that night. I mean, it really took it deeply in my heart. I thought I have to get an understanding of how God feels about me. That's what's going to heal my heart. But that was my journey. And then shortly after that, I met Alan Hood, who was across the street at seminary and came in to chapel. They asked me to share my testimony quite obviously in our sophomore class chapel. And I did, and he was there listening that day.
Wow, that's powerful. And for those of us who have experienced, and I have experienced, that kind of just really tangible sense of God's presence and his love, it is life-changing. It was life-changing for me. And interestingly, for me, it happened similarly when I was in a crisis of faith, when I was in my early 20s. And God showed up in a way that has marked me for my entire life. And so grateful for that. You mentioned that you told your testimony in chapel. Alan Hood, who later would become a key member, a key leader at the International House of Prayer, heard that, and you became part of, what was it, like a discipleship group that he led. Talk about that and kind of how that kind of brought you to International House of Prayer eventually.
Yeah. So I think it was an assignment for seminary. But he was connected to that girl Molly, who I just said had prayed for me in such a beautiful way and just marked my heart in such a beautiful way. He was connected to her, and so these other students. I think he had an assignment. I think it was an assignment, part of his ministry training, because he was just in seminary at the time, to lead a discipleship group. And then he led the discipleship group, and then kind of our purpose was to then go and share our testimonies in Methodist churches throughout the country. And so we did some traveling together. So it was a core group. I don't remember exactly how many, but around 8 to 10 college students my same age. And I met Alan and his amazing, beautiful wife, Rachel, who I adore. So I met the two of them, and they had one child at the time, and Samuel, and the journey began. I was so rough during that time. I did not like, well, how can I say it? I didn't trust any men. I didn't trust anybody to, discipleship of Shelley Hundley was a very difficult task. I remember being on a ministry trip and refusing to talk to him because he had very gently called me out on some character growth that I needed, that was real and true, accurate. And it pressed me. And I remember I yelled in his face, and I said, "You are a manipulator, and you are a controller, and you're just like my dad." The literal worst thing I could have ever said to a person. And beautiful heart that he has. He stood there and he just looked at me in the eye and he said, "Shelley, everything that you just said is accurate to how men have treated you in your life. And I stand in place of them and ask you to forgive those that have treated you that way." He just stood as a representative, which made me more angry, because then I couldn't continue to be silent to him. I was just kind of like, what am I supposed to do with that? But he said, "My wife and I love you, and we're not going away." And it was just beautiful. And he said, "I'll give you as much time as you need, but we're not going anywhere." And they just continued to just love me so faithfully through my whole life. But Alan had been to Kansas City, and he didn't know Mike yet personally, but he had been in the Bible school in Kansas City. And at the end of our ministry trip, or I don't know if it was the end, it was kind of peppered throughout, we went to 2 or 3 places where Alan felt like we could receive from the Lord in a special way. Like something was happening there that was worth taking note of and receiving from. And one of those places was Kansas City. And so when we went through there, and we had listened to some Mike Bickle teachings in the car on the way, different places. And so I knew about Mike to be the person that teaches on the love of God. That was what drew me. And when we went there, that's kind of how it was. And after just being there for a short time, I just felt really strongly to come to Kansas City. And so I actually didn't finish my degree at Asbury, and I moved to Kansas City after my sophomore year. and joined the little Bible school, Grace Training Center at that time. And it for the purpose of, I want to sit under this teaching of the love of God. And Alan wasn't there; he was still at seminary, but we stayed connected, and we've been close friends. And he and his wife have just been beautiful mentors to me all these years. But that's how I ended up kind of that thread of ending up in Kansas City as well.
Yeah. I met Alan and his wife for the first time at the Restore Conference in February. And, again, I don't know him well, but what I saw and witnessed there was a very, very tender heart towards the things of the Lord. And it was really a pleasure to meet him and also to know of the role that he's played in supporting women victims of Mike Bickle, despite the fact that he was part of the system for a really long time. But I've seen a man who seems humble and able to admit that. And so that's really a wonderful thing. So you went to, again, this is a precursor all to International House of Prayer. It wasn't founded till 1999. This is a few years before that. You're at the Bible school that Mike Bickle is doing. Was that associated with Metro Vineyard there in Kansas City? Okay.
I think Metro Vineyard had just changed to Metro Christian Fellowship, but yeah, it had different iterations in its name. I got there right after they left the Vineyard and became like independent.
Okay.
So Metro Christian Fellowship was the name of it.
Okay. And I remember, because we were a part of Vineyard back in Chicago at the time, but I remember hearing about Mike Bickle. In fact, my husband tells me that he came and spoke at our church, and I kind of remember it. To me, he just was nothing great. That's what I recall. It just didn't hit with me, but I was like, whatever, but apparently he had come, and I heard him would have been right around the same time. But he starts the International House of Prayer. But before this, you spent a year in Bolivia, right? I mean, you were really interested in missions work. So you were at the Bible school for like a year, then you went to Bolivia. And describe your work there, because it was pretty intense. I mean, you were working with sex trafficking victims. Is that right?
That's right. I was in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, and I actually went there to join a Bible smuggling team. To take
Wow.
Bibles. Yeah.
Yeah, this is back in the Brother Andrew days, and that was kind of the thing, wasn't it?
And
Yeah.
I mean, I think for me, Jesus turned me around so deeply. I just wanted to do whatever was the most radical thing for God. But so I went there to join a Bible smuggling team that was going to head into the Middle East. And when I got there, the team leader said that he just heard from the Lord that we had to wait. And I don't think he want to take Bibles when Jesus says wait to the team leader. So we waited. But what I ended up doing was that team leader was associated with a home for boys, for street kids or boys. And so I just started working in that full time. In college, I was studying to do social work and like counseling with children. And that was kind of where I thought I was going to go because of my own, trauma. But anyway, I ended up working with this home for boys and finding out that there was no home for girls, and finding out that most people had given up on the girls, that they had not even tried to find them, that they were all within prostitution rings. And, being a young 20-something who felt like Jesus had done already the impossible, why wouldn't he want to rescue these little girls? That's what I did. So I connected with that home and helped pioneer the home for girls. The area that I helped with was actually going to the places of prostitution and finding where they were and gaining trust with them. And the biggest memory that I have of that time was it takes quite a while to find little girl. I grew up in South America, so I speak, fluent Spanish, dual citizenship with Colombia. And so, language-wise, I can get into the culture and all of that quite easily. But the little girls in Latin America, I don't think they last more than a day on the street. So a lot of these little girls would be indigenous populations that maybe their parents send them, or sometimes the parents, you sell them, unknown, not knowing, maybe they're given money for their daughter to have a new life or a better life. But you never see them. And so the biggest problem is finding them. And I remember hearing some tips that the taxi drivers knew where they were. And so I just started building a relationship with the taxi drivers. And then one night, I think it was 3 a.m, I couldn't get anybody to go with me for my little church that I went to. They were all like, "You're crazy. We're not going with you." But I sat in the back of a taxi and he drove me to this far off location where they were just picking up these little girls, just one at a time. And I think it just, the thing that hit me was how young they really were. And I was expecting 13, 12, and I saw 6, 7, 5, 6, 7, and these little girls would have makeup on, like lipstick and stuff, and no shoes. So it was just kind of like this. I just remember that being such a visual. And one by one, they just came through and put them into the taxis, and each taxi took each girl to the guy that had asked for them. I just remember trying not to throw up and just feeling the fury, and then just it was the darkest thing I had seen at that time. And I was able to break through into some groups of those girls and gain trust. I would just sit on the floor in the bathroom and announce to the girls at some dance places that I knew that some of the older ones were. I would just sit on the floor and say, "Hey, I'm Sister Shelley," or whatever. And if anybody wants to talk to me about their friend, maybe their friend needs some help, just that kind of thing. So I did that. And I was there for a year until a home was opened up for the girls. And I think it's continuing. I've been in contact with the main guy, but I don't know where it all is at today. But at the end of that year, I really wanted to do that for the rest of my life. And that, and the little boys, which was just just beautiful work. I mean, now I actually have my own little boys, and I just can't imagine the life that these guys would live. But you would find them. They would sleep in trees, and they'd be eating out of trash dumps. But it was a similar process of gaining trust. They wouldn't just come to a home just because there's a home. There needed to be a lot of trust there. And I actually worked in the home with the boys each day, just kind of their routine, and did Bible times with them, and just built relationship with them. And I've had a few of them stay in touch with me, which is neat. But I love to do it. I really wanted to do it. I think the thing that sent me back to Kansas City after that year was I just felt like I was kind of, I don't know if it's kind of a funny way to say it, but it's almost like I was operating on spiritual adrenaline. I didn't have a lot of depth. I knew I didn't have a lot in the scriptures. I knew I didn't even have that much in a prayer life. I just was somebody that would just kind of believe that God wanted to do something and would just kind of jump into it. And I did some preaching and things at that time, and I had a lot of open doors to stay there. But I just felt like I need a season of going deeper. I feel like I could continue and it would be good, but there's just more that I could have that would be a deeper foundation. So I had headed back to Kansas City to develop a prayer life and to, just get to know God in a deeper personal way. And that's what I did. I moved back. I lived with a family in Kansas City and helped with childcare some, and really just dug into as many hours of prayer as I could, and worked as a waitress to support my prayer habit, and prayed as long as I could. I mean, and so that ended up being right around that 1997, 1998 period of time when it was the precursor to the House of Prayer that started in 1999. And there was a lot of spiritual kind of activity, I guess you'd say. There was a sense of poignancy in the air. There was a feeling of the prayer meetings that the church had, there were 3 prayer meetings a day, seemed to be just more engaged and stronger. And there was just a sense of God is doing something. And so I was right in the midst of that.
I'm just really struck, and we could probably spend an awful lot of time talking about your life, even outside of International House of Prayer. But the way that this ministry attracted some of the most sold out, authentic, sincere believers. And what's sad is, and I've said this before, but in all of my reporting, I will say the one characteristic that I have found that predators seem to just have a sixth sense for, and it is that sincerity. It's the pure in heart, and they prey on that, which is actually just about the most wicked thing you can imagine. People that have a childlike faith, exactly like Jesus, said that we should have, those are the very ones that often get preyed upon. Although in some ways, the fact that you had that suspicion in the back of your head because of what you'd experienced kind of worked a little bit to protect you in some ways. So you come back and you're working there. You worked for then what became Friends of the Bridegroom, or was at the time Friends of the Bridegroom, which is Mike Bickle's own personal ministry. And then you said that you kind of stumbled into doing what's now known as like this harp and bowl style of worship. Describe what that is for the uninitiated who don't really know. I've heard of this, but I'm not sure that I really know what the harp and bowl worship is, although it's something that Mike Bickle made famous.
hmm so I have a musical background. I played jazz piano and stuff. I'm not the best singer ever, but I did lead worship some. And so if you think about it, for the musicians out there, we'll kind of get this. In jazz, you have a dynamic where you play a song that everybody knows, a jazz standard, and then you go into a chord progression, and everybody solos off of that chord progression, and then you come back to the song that everybody knows. That's kind of basically what Mike called it, the harp and bowl model, because of Revelation 5, where before the throne of God, there's a harp of the songs of the saints going up, and there's the bowl of incense, the prayer. So it's just a prayer and worship combined. And what happened was I was in a prayer meeting where there was no worship leader, and someone, either Deborah or one of the other girls, outed me to Mike as being a worship leader. I had never talked to Mike at this time. In fact, I think chronologically, I was just connecting to the girls, and I'm trying to think if I was on the payroll as research right before this, maybe just barely, or if it was right after, but somewhere around that. But I had never talked to him, but I had connected with this core group of girls, and I ended up leading worship, and he made me so nervous. I sang a song. I was unprepared, right? I was leading worship at the very last second. And I started out on piano, and I sang a song that was a newer worship song, and no one knew it. So he came over to me and said, that was really great. He whispered in my ear, but like nobody knows it. So it didn't work. Like come up with another one. And the way he talked to me was so kind of brusque that I just panicked. And every song I'd ever known just went right out of my head, and I had nothing. And so I didn't know what to do. So, but what we ended up doing during that prayer meeting, we ended up kind of singing what he would call singing in the spirit for a while. And then somebody would pray. And from the prayer, I would just kind of take a phrase or a phrase that was maybe an answer to the prayer, that was just a Bible verse, something simple. And I would sing that. And then the whole room would start singing it. And there's a chorus. So back to the jazz model, it was like a worship song, except for I didn't do great on that part. And then there was like a spontaneous singing. Everybody could just sing from their own hearts out loud, whatever. And then a time of a person praying, and then me grabbing a phrase from their prayer, and the whole room singing the phrase, which kind of is a neat way to agree with somebody's prayer. It's kind of neat. And then at the end, to go back to worship song, but again, I was kind of failing at that part. But at the end of the prayer meeting, I remember I was sitting in the car with the family that I was living with, and Mike came up and knocked on the glass. And I was panicked. I was like, this is where he tells me I can't be in the church anymore. I lied when he said, can you lead worship? I should have said, no, I cannot, or whatever. And so I was expecting a rebuke, honestly. But I came out and we started walking back and forth in the parking lot. And he was excited. And he said, this is it. This is the model. This is what we need to do. I want you back at tomorrow morning's prayer meeting, and the lunch prayer meeting, and the night prayer meeting, all 3 prayer meetings. I want you just here singing and doing this every time. And I was just kind of like, it was like being run over by a train. I mean, I didn't even know what was happening. And it's a good moment to say, for those that have never been a part of the International House of Prayer, those that have know exactly what I'm talking about. But there's kind of an aura of who gets to be close to Mike. It's one of the really deeply, I now see as evil dynamics that was going on there, or at least profoundly unhealthy and potentially cult-like, is the dynamic of, so while I'm talking to him, the whole family's going, oh, she's having a conversation with Mike. I wonder what he's saying, because that's how everybody was. And so there was this sense of like being in conversation with him, being singled out, being talked to, being asked to do something with like a currency. And he's the one that created that. He said that, I mean, you can't just develop that in a whole church body because somebody's a gifted teacher. I've been around many gifted teachers that do not create anything like that. So that was something that he created in his own health. But that was the beginning of it. And that's what I did. I started singing at every prayer meeting, and continuing to kind of experiment with this harp and bowl model, and that he ended up calling it. And that led up into the months of us starting the House of Prayer, and being formally an intern that helped start that after just a few months of practicing in the prayer meetings, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So somewhere in this time period, he tells you that he wants you to go with him to rent a car or something, right? There's an experience. Tell about what happened during that, what you were expecting to happen, and then what actually happened.
Yeah. So, around this time as well, just to kind of flesh the story out, I ended up moving in with Deborah Perkins and a few of these other girls, her sister, and another roommate, and later on Misty, because Deborah's sister got married and there was this new spot, so Misty moved in after that. But so there's this tight group, and there ended up being 5 of us that were interns for the House of Prayer. We were actually we were actually getting chairs and putting the House of Prayer together in a small trailer, and that was the car rental situation. Mike said, I didn't have a car. And Mike at that time said, well, let me take Shelley. I'll rent her a car so that she can do all these errands, pick up these chairs, do all this stuff, get this thing rolling. It was days before we started the House of Prayer. So it was the first time that I was ever by myself in a vehicle with Mike. And in my state of mind, which just shows where I was, and I think I was around 21. I can get a little hazy with exactly how old I was, but somewhere around this time frame. And I get in the car with him, and I immediately think to myself, calmly, this is where he's going to sexually assault me. Now I thought that because he's a man and a pastor, and that was the level of my healing. I'd done a lot of great counseling, and I was still working through things, but that was a very clear thought to me. I thought, because he's the big pastor, which was my dad. My dad, people would come up to me and say, wow, what is it like to be Ray Hundley's daughter? That was my dad's name, and, wow, it just must be amazing. And so I was used to that. And here was another guy who people saw that way, and he's a pastor at that level. And I thought, that's what's going to happen. So I moved my hand over to the door handle, and I just thought through what I was going to do. And I just thought, okay, we're going kind of slow. If he reaches over and tries to do something, and he probably will, I can jump out. Like, I'll just jump out and roll. I'll be fine. And so I had my hand on the handle, and I wasn't even panicky. I was just like, this is what happens. And it didn't happen. He didn't try to do anything physically. But I got to the car rental place, and we walk in there, and he just says really kind of nonchalantly to the people working at the counter, I need to rent a car for my daughter. And it was the first time they used the word daughter. And now I think as a 40-something, I think, he was just trying to get through insurance. He was being shady and trying to kind of get around something. There was a reason for this. But in my little, young 20s heart, I was going, whoa. It was both a trigger word that made me angry at him and made me want to punch him for even trying to be my father. And then another deep longing, something inside of me that said, oh, could he view me that way? Oh my gosh, could I have a relationship with Mike Bickle that way? And so I had these kind of highs and lows, these feelings going on at the same time. And so he signed the paperwork. He looked over at me and winked at me because he saw that I was noticing that he said that. And he was just he winked, and he leaned over and said, I like that. I like the sound of that. And it was intrusive in the way of it was, that was the first time that what I would really characterize as this over the top, unhealthy level of father that he stepped in, and it was invasive. I felt it was good. I thought it was good. It felt good. I also felt like I might want to punch him. I had all these different feelings, but that was the first of many, many times where he would end up signing his emails dad. He would call me his daughter, all through all the next years. He would introduce me as his daughter to people and, other leaders. He would give me a lot of room as a spiritual daughter, I guess. But I don't feel like he even really bothered to say the spiritual part. You know what I mean? It was just really strong. And, now in a place of health, I can't, that it was unhealthy right from the very beginning. That's to do that. And he knew my history with my dad. He had asked those questions. In fact, I think it's part of Mike's MO that he knows pretty much everything about everybody that's around him by asking questions, or other people telling him. He knows everybody's stories and their weak areas. And I've seen over the last 2 years how he has used that multiple times. But in my case, he knew exactly what he was doing. and he just bulldozed it. And it felt to me like exciting. He still had some proving to do. Like I said, I had thought he was going to make some kind of physical sexual assault, move, and he never did. But something was happening emotionally.
And we've heard that in multiple stories. I mean, most recently with Dr. Michael Brown calling, at least according to, well, I think they both admit, actually, I don't even have to say allegedly, he did call this young woman his daughter and had a father-daughter relationship. And it's gotta, I mean, when you have a hole, and I used to do ministry, so I remember, the hole, and you would try to direct those people towards God as their father. But I think a predatory pastor or somebody who just, it stokes their ego, but in this case, gave him position, gave him power, likes to step into that role and knows that they can. And it's interesting to me where you say he saw the look on your face or he saw the impact it had. And I will say, that's often what predators seem to do. And you even said at one point, like he would say something like, this is what a father says or something, and he would have like these father words, and you made an actual collage of all of these father sayings. That's how important. And did you post this like on a poster where you would see this?
Yeah, like he would say all these different things in emails, and at this time because of my own father, and I had confronted my dad, I had blew up my family system as a truth teller. And I had no relationship with him. And during the first few years of IHOP, I also went through physical sickness, pretty severe sickness where I was hospitalized and very sick for the first 3 years, off and on. And during those times, Mike would come and sit in the hospital room and talk to me and, tell me church history stories, or he gave me a lot of seminary assignments during that time, like systematic theology and church history, and kind of fed the intellect side. My parents were both, well, my dad was a PhD that studied at Cambridge, and there was something of that intellect part that was kind of untapped for me, having not finished college and different stuff. And so he kind of saw that and sewed into that and had me do different assignments. But a picture of what you're talking about was, one time I was in the hospital, and he began to paint a picture of my father and himself, and very overtly. And he said, if you called your dad right now, would he come? And I was mad that he said that, because I was like, I don't want him to come. I mean, he's an unrepentant abuser. I had forgiven him, and I'd walked through some kind of moments, some closure moments with my dad, but I said, I don't want him to come. He said, no, I want to know, would he come? I said, no, he would not come if I called him. And he said, he's not a father, and I don't want you to call him your father anymore. He's a monster. And he said, a father, and then he described everything he was doing. A father would be here right now. A father would be sitting next to you in the hospital bed, in your hospital room. A father would be the one that talks to the doctors and finds out, what's going on. And he just went through a whole list of everything he did, everything he was doing. It just cemented it. And the collage that you're talking about, which is a part of, I submitted it as the part of the investigation report, and it puts me as one of the 17 women that he has abused because of the language that he used in that email. In those emails, I took phrase by phrase, and I printed it, and I cut out little phrases and put it on one sheet of paper, like a little scrapbook, and I had it in kind of a discreet place in my room, where I could see it. Like, I think it was the inside of a closet. And what was going on with that with me was, this was a time too for me where I was trying to gather evidence. What's a father like? Because my dad wasn't just a person who went off the handle and sexually abused me a few times. He was also just, it was horrible. And there was never any attachment. There was never any good father. There's not a good story. I don't have a good story with him. And so whether it was Deborah Perkins talking about her dad, she would tell a story about her dad that was really neat. I'd go in my room and write down in my journal, Deborah's dad did this. It was just kind of like this really precious, like, gathering of evidence kind of thing that I would do. And I did that with Mike. I gathered the evidence. This is the stuff that a father says. And he says that this is what a father's like. And so I put these little phrases in there. And when the story first broke, or even before it had fully broken, and I just knew about Deborah and was connecting and supporting her, I remember saying to my husband, like, I guess I have to burn that thing and to find this collage. I said, somewhere there's a collage that I made with phrases that he said that were so beautiful and precious to me, is how I felt. And I did that with other fatherly statements. It was like my own little way of kind of constructing what a father is like. And it's completely heartbreaking that the whole time he was doing that, he was my dad. Like, I mean, he's exactly the same as my dad. And here I was just being completely duped by it. And he spent tons of time creating this. So it must have been important for him, for me to feel this way and for me to see him that way.
Well, I'm sure it built into his ego, but it also made it so that, and you've made reference to this already, but that he was coming to your house a lot. And which, by the way, were there any interns who were men, or were they all young women?
Yeah, there were two men and three girls. And then people like Deborah Perkins was not an intern. She was like greater than an intern, right? She was like, we were all like, yes, sir. I'm not really a standard. Like we were just like, Deborah was somebody that we just all wanted to be like her because she was just fiery for God and deep in prayer. So she was not, she was too cool to be an intern for real. But yeah, there were three girls and two boys, but I bet she didn't go over to the boys' house. I'm sure that he did not.
So he was coming to your house all the time. There were like movie nights. I think I read about those. I mean, things that he's a married man with kids, and he's hanging out with all of these young women at their house. And he's even, did you say he parked like further away so people wouldn't see his car?
Yeah, he would come in and out, and he would go into the different girls' rooms and see the different decoration changes that they had done, and just kind of fool around. I remember him jumping on one of the girls' beds, like just playing around in the different rooms, and he would bring movies or documentaries or whatever. And he would come in when I was sick. There, he'd come in. He'd be like, "Where's my girl?" And it would be like, "Oh, Shelley's over here," and he would take me in the car and drive me around if I was sick or whatever, and tell me stories or whatever it was. And again, like the type of grooming with me, and it was confusing when I was first putting all this together. I was processing and sat with my own counselor and talked about the scrapbook and the different things. And the way I've kind of come down on it is I had a lot of purity in my heart of wanting to know what a father was like. And this guy just came in and violated it and stomped on it, mostly because I was not his chosen victim, but my friends were. And that's what he was about. And he normalized this crazy stuff of like, let's meet at this restaurant, but don't tell anybody. Or I'm going to come over, but I'll park a different spot. Or just all that kind of stuff. He did that kind of thing all the time.
And you also became like the conference director at IHOP. And so you were doing a number of conferences at the Forerunner Church. And as I understand it, there was sort of a back room there, which sounds a lot like Mike's office at the International House of Prayer, where it locked from the inside. And you observed some things that now you're looking back going, what was I thinking? But at the time, again, you're overlooking this. You're just throwing out the red flags, even though now looking back, you see them. Talk about what you observed with Mike and women and that back room.
Yeah, it's so hard for me because at a certain point, I was the MC of the conferences, and I also did the organizational behind the scenes admin for them. And a lot of the time, I pretty much just ran them for years. The local ones and a lot of the one thing big, which was the big youth conference once a year. But it's just so hard. Like the backstage area would be like my little workstation and Mike's workstation and maybe one other person's workstation back there in an open area. And then just kind of down the hallway was a back room that was pretty much exactly like the back room that he had at the prayer room, which had locks that locked from the inside. And just multiple locks that you could do all kinds of locky things with, basically, right? But and he would always say to me, like, it's great for taking a nap. If you just want to go in there and just lock yourself in and take a nap, I do it sometimes. So he had his little stories about it. But and I don't want to jump ahead of chronologically, but I just kind of have to explain about those rooms. But when Alan Hood is actually the one that called me and told me, Deborah asked him to tell me about it, about her abuse and what she'd been through, and to check on me and see if I had been through anything. That's actually what her first motivation was, because of the closeness and all of that. And when Alan first called me, he was fresh into just having heard from Deborah, and lots of emotion. And I think both of us were just kind of hoping that somehow it wasn't true, even though there was, immediate recognition in Alan's heart that it was. There's just that tiny dot where you're just like, could there be some other way that this all pans out? And when he told me, I just sobbed. I had immediately about 5 things, and these rooms were one of them, that made me say, it's 100% true. And I just remember us both bawling, like just both. My husband swooped in and took my boys somewhere on. I was just crying on the back porch, talking about it with Alan. But one of the things was these rooms, because I remember him going into that back room with multiple, people I can think of. The most predominant ones are Deborah and Misty, that I remember him spending long, long periods of time in the back room. And I remember when they would come out, the girl would look upset. And I always thought it was or flustered or off. And I always thought, man, he's probably like letting them know something that he needs to change in the organization or a class or I don't know. I just figured something of a pastoral nature was going on there. By this point, I was no longer the girl that had her hand on the door lock, right? I really trusted him at this point. And I never imagined once, and never for 1 second thought that anything sexual was going on with any of these girls, ever. Never thought it. It didn't even occur to me, and I brushed it away. It was like, didn't even occur. Even though I saw him going in that room. And I just I think I had to definitely have a few counseling sessions for my own heart of just thinking through. I was right there. Like, I was like, I don't know, how many yards away from that room. And these girls I care so deeply about. I mean, I love these girls. Love Misty and Deborah so much. And some of the others too that I've seen in those positions with him that I believe were most likely abused by him, or in some cases I do know that they were. But I just like the powerlessness. I mean, and I've shared a little bit of my story with Bolivia, but I've had a family member that went, off the rails and tried to hurt his own kids. And I was the one right there, even though it was my own family member, saying, let's get this handled by the police and stop this. Like, I have multiple stories like that in my life. This is core to me as being a protector. And I don't know how you get past, I don't know how you get over that.
I haven't heard a single person yet who suspected it with Mike. Everybody said the same thing. And, we have limits to our ability to conceive things, especially when we're within a system. I know Alan Hood telling me the exact same thing. I mean, Misty had her own cubbyhole or whatever in his office at IHOP. And again, Misty's never come out and said she was abused, but those are the facts of the matter. And they spent an inordinate amount of time.
Inordinate.
Yeah, in that back room or his office, both of them. And a lot of people witnessed it. So again, hindsight is 20/20, right? But at the time, we can only know what we know, and we have limited knowledge. So, and you've said to me, I mean, you're saying it now, you never suspected it, but there's a lot of people that will say, well, why didn't they just say no? Well, why did they give into it? And again, I've heard enough of these stories that I get it. But for those who absolutely are just going, wait, these were adult women. They knew what they were doing. They should know better. They participated in it. Explain what this system, which again, you were never sexually abused, but you were part of this system, how it conditions you to think and to act, even when boundaries are crossed.
I don't think that people have understood enough about the spiritual dynamic and the spiritual language and how powerful the misuse of the prophetic, as the charismatic church would, call it, really was, and how just completely twisted and difficult to disentangle that really is. And for those that know me from my years at the House of Prayer, I love that God talks, that God speaks to us, and I still love that, but I have more questions now as to how that can be walked out safely. I'm not ready to figure that out right now. I'm so wrecked over how the prophetic words, God's words, were used and usurped for these girls, and where you had these weighty prophetic utterances and ideas. And an example is Deborah, who, when she started dating her amazing husband, now, when she started dating him, like any other girls in their 20s that are roommates, she'd come home from the date. We'd all be excited to hear how it went. What did he say? Does he really like you? Like, what do you think? Like, doing all of that kind of thing. Well, she would have a lot of excitement about him, and we were all excited about how great he was. But she would go into these dark swirls of weeping, crying, like complete emotional distress over one of the things she said was that she would say to us, and we were all just sitting there going, what's going on? And she would cry and say, I'm not supposed to marry him. Like, I'm supposed to wait for Arthur. There's this older man that I'm supposed to marry. And she said that. And so when I heard this prophecy thing from Alan that day, I was like, it's 100% true. Like, she said it at that time. She didn't say it was Mike, but she said, I'm supposed to wait for Arthur, King Arthur, and this is Lancelot. This is the infidelity to what God's plan is, which shows how deep this thing was. That you would be dating a great Christian guy who is fun and engaging and respectful and loves you and all those things, and that you'd be in torment. You'd be in torment during a beautiful time because of this word, because of this vice grip of this prophetic word. And that's where, like, I really think that Mike used cult tactics. I think he is a cult leader. I'm not ready to understand the whole big dynamic of IHOP in general. Like, give me some years. I don't even know how to parse it all. But I will say that with his victims, he was just a cult leader with these women. I mean, the way that he used prophetic words to lock them in, the way he, won their whole family systems. But the spiritual part, I don't think people have understood how deep that is. He wasn't just saying, like, here's 5 ways to, I don't know, live a godly life in your workplace. Like, he was saying, this is who you are. You are the beloved of God. You are this to God. God feels this way about you. And so the message and the person merged. And for these young women that he gathered around, their whole families worshiped him. Their whole family system feels deeply connected to him and trusts him. And then he says, you're the one. My wife is going to die, and you will be my next wife. I feel deeply saddened when people question why somebody wouldn't, be hooked into that. I think it's very, very deep, and it's a dark, twisted web. I've had some people who I've talked to over the last 2 years who say, I have some stories to tell you, Shelley, but I can't until God himself speaks to me and releases me to do it, because they're spiritually locked in their silence. It's not normal. I've been a vocal person about my own sexual abuse history for more than 20 years now. I've done lay counseling and discipleship and mentoring and kind of coaching and walking with women through that. I've educated myself for the last 10 years and done courses with American Christian Counselors Association. I can sit with survivors. This is different. This is not like that. And it's my feeling that it will take years and years and years for some of his victims to come out of the spiritual bond that goes on.
And certainly most profound for those who had sexual experiences with him, who this is the spiritual abuse is bound up even in those experiences. Um, but also you even told me like you couldn't make decisions without checking with leadership. Like he cultivated a dependency, and you would see people go in to quit their job and they would come out not quitting their jobs, right? I mean, you saw that happen with numerous people where they'd even maybe up their involvement.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was a known joke even. I'm going in to quit. I'm going in to quit IHOP or to quit my role or, whatever it is. And we would be like, good luck with that. And they would come out with new responsibilities, more work, more commitment. And that was over and over and over again. He was extremely persuasive, and the picture for me personally is, I left IHOP. I had been gone for, you know, a good amount of time. I mean, really over a 2-year period. I was gone most of the 2 years. I was back a little bit, and then I left again. And I met a phenomenal guy. I decided to marry because he's awesome, and just best choice ever for me. And I remember thinking, but like Mike hasn't approved this. Like Mike hasn't signed off on this. Like, what if he, and he met my husband one time, but it was like, I just had this deep like panic that hit. And I remember praying through and going, God, Mike and the other leaders, it wasn't just Mike, it was like Mike and the other leaders might not know that I still love God, even though I've left IHOP. Like, I mean, and I'm marrying a really great Christian guy, like, and it's all beautiful, but like, what if they don't approve? And I just felt the gentle leading of the Lord of just being like, Shelley, like, I am your savior. Like, I mean, like, I am like, who am I? Like, I'm the one that is leading you in your life. And I had people around me that could lead me in my life, and my brother could speak it. So the different people like that know me. It was this root that had to be pulled out, and it was significant for me. It was hard. And again, I also, as I'm telling that, expressing that, I know I have been a part of the system that has caused others to feel that way. I know my students have felt that way, and likely have felt that way about me. Like they needed me to prove likely what it was that they were doing. The whole system was like that, but Mike's approval was the most important, and everybody else's was a little bit. But it was an unhealth in the whole system. But it was so deep. I mean, I, as a grown person gone from the place, still had to go through, if Mike Bickle thinks I'm making a poor choice, or if he doesn't think I'm as godly because I don't spend time in this physical prayer room in Kansas City, Missouri, am I still okay? Can I be a deep Christian outside of there? Can I make a decision to marry a really phenomenal person that will be, a beautiful life choice? And like you said, I don't have a sexual abuse bond that also would cement me in shame and all kinds of, who knows what else he has said in some of these cases with these women. So I just look at it and I just go, I don't ask the question, why couldn't they say no? I ask the question, how can Deborah and Tammy and others that have come forth, how did they do it? How did they get free like this? And I've said it to Deborah almost every day for a year. Like, I am so proud of you. I don't know how you shook free from this, because it was deep enough for those of us that were not even in that kind of a bond. And so I'm like, this is going to take a while.
Just listening to you, it sounds like it was the Hotel California. Like, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. And that is so, it's such a hallmark of a cultic kind of system. And surely that was, I think was very much a cult in the way that it operated.
Can I say one other thing to that, Julie? Something that stumps me is how Alan Hood was so different in almost all of these practices than Mike. Like, if you went into Alan, you had a shot at quitting. You had a pretty good shot at quitting. You know what I mean? Like, you could quit. It'd be all right. You know what I mean? You could move somewhere and still love Jesus. It'd be okay. So it was a Mike thing, and even with that, it'd be like people would go to Alan and he would say yes to it. And, and then Mike would find out about it and get involved in it. And the person would end up saying no, getting talked right back into it. There was such a weird dynamic. Mike in his room with these girls by themselves. Alan Hood would never do that. I mean, I'd have to beat his wife to it because she'd be there speaking into it faster. But he has everybody in his life with the ability to check that kind of stuff. And it's amazing to me that we accepted a different category for him than in Alan. Alan wouldn't do it, but Mike, well, he's Mike. That's the thing everybody has always said.
Yeah, a real double standard, and especially because there was like a real purity culture at IHOP. So, almost it's so weird. Like on one side, just this hyper vigilance about purity, and then on the other side, sexual abuse happening by the very leader. It's so wicked. But I want to go to what precipitated you leaving, which started with something that happened in 2012. There was a major scandal involving the death of Bethany Deon. And my understanding, she was discovered in a van. She was a 27-year-old nurse, discovered in a van with a plastic bag over her head. She was dead. And a suicide note, supposedly in her handwriting right near her. Her death was initially ruled a suicide, but then she was part of this religious group that her husband sort of cultivated that had loose ties to IHOP, but it was modeled after IHOP and was very culty. A couple years, or was it even that long? But Micah Moore, who was a part of this group, confessed to her murder, and then eventually the charges were dropped against him because apparently a lack of evidence there. But you and Alan Hood were kind of tasked by International House of Prayer to sort of investigate, because so much scrutiny now. The national spotlight is on the International House of Prayer because of the death of this woman and the investigation. So you guys were tasked with the job of investigating this, and I don't know what you can even say about it, but yeah. And I know that you've told me that you can't say very much because it's an open investigation. So, but what happened there from your perspective, as much as you can tell?
It is a tough one for me because, and the only reason I'm clarifying that is because I could never investigate. You know what I mean? I wouldn't be able to investigate. But as two pastoral people, we were there to support what seemed like a tragic death, and then there were occurrences that happened that involved the police and suggested that there was perhaps something else that had gone on, and it's still open. They're still pursuing what really happened to Bethany. As you mentioned, I have checked very recently with the police again. I can't talk about the details of what happened until the case is resolved, and it's my understanding that they have evidence being brought in, even in recent times. But if anybody would have the courage to still continue to give information to the police about it, I think I would want to say to do that. I want truth to come forth for Bethany and for her parents in its fullness. I don't have a specific agenda related to what that truth looks like, and I never did. I just, in that situation, it's very rare in a pastoral case that you go from pastoring and helping to counsel grief to it being something that has to involve the police. And this was one of those times.
I do want to say I did reach out to Captain Rhonda Montgomery of the Jackson County Sheriff's Office just to confirm, because again, it's been, this is 2012, we're talking 13 years ago. And I said, is this still an open investigation? She responded quickly, actually, and I quote, "The initial suspect was arrested and charged in the fall of 2012. However, 2 years later, the Jackson County Prosecutor's Office dismissed the charges. Therefore, no one has been convicted of the murder. The Sheriff's Office continues to seek justice for Bethany, and we welcome any and all tips that may lead us to the arrest and conviction of a suspect in the case." Interesting that she says no one's been convicted of the murder. Nobody's talking about this as a suicide at all anymore. And in a later email from her, because we went back and forth just a little bit, and she said that she was involved in a case from the outset, and she would really love to see justice. So I don't get the sense that they're dragging their feet at all, but she seemed very eager. So I do want to just say she ended our correspondence by saying, anyone with tips to call the sheriff's office at 816-541-8017. Again, 816-541-8017, or anonymously at the Greater Kansas City Crime Stoppers Tips Hotline, and that is 816-474-8477. Again, 816-474-8477. And again, as we know from a lot of these, what seem like cold cases, the evidence, sometimes it's one tip that is that key. So I know a number of people who have been a part of IHOP will be listening to this podcast. And I just encourage you, if you do know anything for the sake of this young woman and for some peace and resolution and justice for her family, I do just encourage you to do something about that. But this, because you were, and I apologize for saying that you were tasked with investigating, that you were tasked with pastoring. I'm sorry, I'm an investigator. It's just in my head. But that you were at this point, as you call it, pushed out of the cult. So for some reason, and maybe you have some suspicions about why that is, you became sort of persona non grata in this organization that you had served so faithfully for over a decade.
I chose to leave. I left for what I thought was a short time. I ended up choosing a new life. That's beautiful. Go figure. But somewhere in the mix of that, and this is curious to me, came up when I did my interview for the IHOP investigation with the Firefly organization. At the very end was just this spin-off conversation about why did Mike try to destroy me as a person who could ever connect to IHOP again? And he did. Like Deborah and I is a great example. It tore our relationship. The lies and the rumors and the pressure. And there were other friends of mine who were told, you will lose your job if you don't stop talking to her. So then no one ever saw me at any anniversary. My data was wiped from the history. It came up in the end of my interview with Firefly because as someone objectively hears it, it seems very evident that Mike was separating me from the victims, that he was maybe feeling unsettled, that Deborah was going to tell me or others were going to say something to me. And that seems to be really make a lot of sense. And if it's because of their stories were starting to kind of crumble, or their compartmentalization was crumbling, or there was a sense that I'm a person that does go all in when I hear something like this. I don't know. And I might never know, but it was evil and it was sad and it was another round of wounding, but it was also kind of my deliverance that set me free from this bond and this need for approval. And it tore that up. I mean, it tore up. And it was really stunning. I'd never, in my 17 years with Mike, except for that one video time that I had with him where I was making my own boundary, and he doesn't like husbands, and he doesn't like boundaries. I did choose to leave, but and there was no reason, because there's just so many, IHOP is there's so many dark tunnels in it, but there was no reason for me leaving, other than I left for what was going to be a short time and really did decide to move into a different life, and establish a different life, and got married and just pursued, marriage and family, which turns out is beautiful. Like, which is something like Mike Bickle greatly discouraged, I mean, he wanted everybody to be single. And he constantly said to all of us girls, I hope you never leave me. I hope you never get married. And we would say that we're getting married. He would act kind of petulant or hurt or bummed. He pushed celibacy. And I'm so sad because it's actually the best. I've been married for 10 years now. It's awesome. And kids is great.
As a mother and grandmother, I can attest to that. Probably the greatest joy in my life, outside of my relationship with the Lord, is my relationship with my spouse and my kids, and now grandkids. It is such a beautiful thing. But I know he ruined that.
Yeah.
He ruined that for some women.
Yeah.
And it's grievous.
It's devastating.
You know, you've got your IHOP system, but often these systems are a part of the larger system, which I often refer to as the evangelical industrial complex, and you'll get blacklisted in the whole system. And it's only, I mean, honestly, it's those of us who have burned every one of those bridges. Like, I don't care. I don't need your approval. I don't care whether you, because I remember when I blew the whistle on Moody, somebody saying to me, now, Julie, you realize when you do this, it's not going to work out too well for you for the other ministries, you know, who are impacted by Moody. And I was like, I couldn't care less. But how crazy that you say that. Like that you think that will keep me quiet or whatever. It was just but it's so sick. And what you described, the way that people are, you know, you're either in or out. And once you're out, everybody else can't talk to you either. I mean, guys, if you're a part of that right now in some church you're in or some system, run. You know, do not look back, run, because that is just such a telltale sign of a cultic system and an unhealthy system, because that's not at all how those should operate. And I remember once being at a church where I left and I had experienced the opposite, where they actually had our family come up and prayed for us and blessed us as we left and understood that we had good reasons for leaving. Wow. Like that was so, you know, that was so huge for me, but it's so unusual. So unusual. How you're treated when you leave an organization tells you a lot about that organization. So, I want to, and this is one of the most disheartening but telling parts of your experience, because after Deborah came out and Tammy and the abuse we began to realize, and there's others, many others, and now we know by the investigation that there more than a dozen, but there's probably dozens and dozens, you know, that didn't participate. Mike Bickle is a serial abuser, is what it seems very clearly. And but even now, so after this all happened, and we've mentioned some of the names, but there are a number of women that it went off in your head, the things that had happened, what you had seen. And at this point, you're thinking you have a close relationship with them. You can be the safe place for them, the safe person for them to finally tell you. Because even as close as you were to Deborah, she never told you the whole time, you know, that you were there. But now you're thinking, as these are coming out, these women are going to come to grips with what happened. Describe what happened as you went and met personally one-on-one with some of these women who you highly suspect were abused by Mike Bickle.
You know, I found out about Deborah and immediately reached out to her, and you know, pretty soon we were able to kind of talk through. Again, there was this push to keep us apart. She's told me since then that, like, the very first time I reached out to her and texted her and said, look, it was before it was public, but Alan had let me know. I reached out to her and said, I don't care about whatever's gone on in the past or whatever, but like, I believe you 100%. I have about 5 to 6 reasons that I do. I am, you know, just deeply distraught for you. I want to be here for you in any way, you know. And I remember, and she's told me recently that she went to her husband and said, whoa, we were wrong about Shelley. Like, whatever this weird swirl was, she's Shelley, you know, she's actually who we thought she was. And so we've walked really closely together, and that's been really beautiful. I'm so, you know, just amazingly proud of her. You know, I talked earlier about seeing little girls in the midst of sexual trafficking, you know, in Bolivia, and that being the darkest thing I've seen. I now would say that, talking to some of my Bickle's victims that are still deeply bonded to him, and still, you know, just they would kind of, I would see something, I would observe a dynamic that would go on where people would be about to tell the truth and then would kind of suddenly, you know, almost bolt upright and start, you know, defending Mike. I saw that on several occasions. And I think that it's going to take a lot more time. It's going to take a lot more patience. And it's my belief, having walked through that, that there is going to be an inner circle of potentially a lot more cult type of abuse that has gone on than what we perceived. More of a dynamic of people, experiencing perhaps a lot more spiritual language. I wouldn't be surprised if 10 years from now we hear that he has said that they're concubines and he's David, or that, multiple women being aware and feeling like they're an inner circle of a Song of Solomon-esque type of, harem, for lack of a better language. Nothing would surprise me about whatever the hold is that's been going on. And I think that I think listening to any survivor is always about patience and gentleness, and that would always be my approach. But now I'm adding the patience into like years. And I think I went through a long period of time of just having to grieve that, like just having to grieve that, like it wrecks me that, some of these women have, stayed single for this abuse dynamic and have lost the chance to move on potentially into a different life, are, putting every single thing into this basket, so to speak, are destroyed. I look at Deborah and Tammy and I go, these guys are, you've talked with them. They're not just okay, they're shining, right? They're going to make it. But not everybody's going to be like that. And it's going to take us 10, 15 years to really see what these stories are. And there are going to be some devastating ones. And that's where I the outrage, just, this guy did this. Like, Mike did this to these girls. He destroyed them. And that just it's been shocking how dark it is. It's been shocking how hard it is to get free. It's been shocking just to see that even with a safe place or confidentiality and gentleness or whatever, that's not going to be enough. This is cult-like in its hold on these women, and it's so profoundly evil. And I just have to say, I am so shocked that anyone would talk in any terms of restoring this guy. Mike Bickle should never be restored in any possible way other than if he came to know Jesus and could, be counted as a recipient of grace. That's it. This is horrible. And I think it takes a certain savvy to fool a 9-year-old like my dad did, but it takes a spiritual web to get these 20-year-olds and to get them and keep them silent for 10, 20 years. It's evil. It's sheer evil. And I'm saying that as somebody who, considered themselves a spiritual daughter of Mike for many years. It is sheer evil. And I don't know why I feel like, I feel devastated for the lack of victories. I just thought, I remember saying to Deborah, we're going to get some victories. And we haven't had those victories as much as we would like. I'm so proud of every woman who maybe I don't even know who they are, but they went forward or participated in investigation, or maybe they've just told their families, or I'm so proud of them for that. Because again, and I said it earlier, my question isn't how did Deborah and these guys, why couldn't they resist it? My question is how did they get free? This is really hard to get free from. That's my point.
Well, and it's deprogramming. It is really cult deprogramming, and it's never too late. I mean, for those who are listening, if anybody is still caught in this web, it is never too late to come into the light. And, I love the verse in scripture where it says that God restores the years the locusts have eaten. And he is, that's the business he's in. And in light of eternity, these things will still seem, short, but yes, it is never too late. And I just urge, I think we need to continue to pray for these women who are caught, because they are just 100%. These are victims. Now, some of them are victimized at the same time. And that's real. And that's something they'll have to deal with. But at the same time, it's never too late.
Absolutely. And I also think that it's important to know for anyone that is hearing this, you don't have to be a Deborah or Tammy and go on Julie Royce, like to be free. I think there's power in it. I'm super proud of them for doing it. And I understand, like Deborah, her motivation I can speak to, she's doing it for the body of Christ and for safety for other young women. That is the only reason she's doing it. It's an incredible cost. And that's it. There's no other reason she's doing it, not to be bad, not to be vindictive, not to tear apart a ministry. She's doing it because the body of Christ needs this kind of help to understand what went wrong and how we can stop this from happening. But also for some survivors out there that they're in a place where they just go, I just need to be free. Tell your family, tell a counselor, keep working through it. And I believe there's some that are like that. They're in that place and they're not ready to participate in a public way about it, but get the healing, separate from Mike, truly, cut off that contact, get with your family members, get with the counselor, and start working through it. We're cheering for you even if we don't know who you are.
I love that. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So if you are walking in the Spirit of the Lord, there will be freedom. You will not feel bondage. So if that's not what you're experiencing, that is not the Spirit of the Lord. Just a very, very dark thing. I think the most dark thing that can happen is when you have someone who definitely is working as an agent of Satan, who is pretending to be an agent of God. And that's clearly what happened here. So, well, Shelley, thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time. And I think I even heard maybe your kids are rustling out there in the background, which means they're up from their naps. But thank you so much. I appreciate your heart and appreciate your boldness, which clearly has carried through despite 17 years in a cultic system. So thanks again. Thanks so much for listening to The Roys Report, a podcast dedicated to reporting the truth and restoring the church. And just a quick reminder that we are listener supported, meaning we don't have advertisers or major grants. We have you. So if you believe in what we're doing, would you please consider donating to The Roys Report? To do so, just go to julieroys, spelled ROYS.com/donate. That's julieroys.com/donate. Also, just a quick reminder to subscribe to The Roys Report on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. That way, you won't miss any of these episodes. And while you're at it, I'd really appreciate it if you'd help us spread the word about the podcast by leaving a review. And then, please share the podcast on social media so more people can hear about this great content. Again, thanks so much for joining us today. Hope you were blessed and encouraged.